The alien Admiral stepped onto the bridge of the human Starship, a sleek and imposing vessel that stood as a symbol of the peace agreements made between his people and the humans. It was his responsibility to ensure the cooperation of the new galactic species, and the Admiral's reputation was built on tact and strategy. Yet as he looked around this ship with its unfamiliar technology and designs, his sharp mind began to sense an undercurrent of something unexpected. The humans had been more than courteous since their arrival, but something felt different about this encounter. He looked down at the report on his datapad. It was a detailed history of humanity's rise through the stars. It was impressive how quickly they had gone from a primitive species to mastering space travel. Yet there was a quiet tension running through the data that even his analytical mind couldn't ignore. It was the children who piqued his curiosity. The humans were training their youth with an intensity unlike anything he had seen before. His thoughts were interrupted by the hum of the door opening, and a crew member standing at attention before him. A small nod, and the crew member gestured for him to follow. They were going to the simulation chamber. It was time for the Admiral to witness firsthand the training of the humans. He had heard rumors of their impressive ability to adapt and grow in combat simulations, but rumors were just that. As the Admiral walked through the sterile halls of the ship, he noted the strange decor. The walls were filled with images of human achievements, from their first steps on the moon to their first colony on Mars, and beyond. He could see pride in every display, a reflection of their unyielding drive to push forward even further into the stars. But he could not shake the feeling that something deeper was at work, something beyond their technologies. Finally, they arrived at the chamber. The door slid open, and the Admiral was greeted with a sight he didn't expect: a small child, no more than 10 years old, sitting in the cockpit of a Starship simulator. The child appeared focused, with their hands gripping the controls as if their very life depended on it. Yet there was an air of calmness in the way they sat, their eyes locked on the holographic screen before them. The Admiral raised an eyebrow. This was the human prodigy. Everyone had been talking about a child no older than 10, but already entrusted with the most advanced simulator on the ship, a test of skill and reflex that even seasoned pilots struggled with. The child's presence was unsettling. The Admiral had witnessed many prodigies in his time, but none like this. The youth were different. It was in their rawness, their instinctual understanding of the cosmos, that defied any logical explanation. Without a word, the Admiral took a step closer and observed the child's every movement. As the simulation began, the child's fingers moved with remarkable speed and accuracy across the controls. The Admiral could feel his own breath catch as the holographic enemy ships appeared around the child's simulator. The child did not flinch or hesitate as the ships closed in on their position. Instead, they moved with a certain fluidity, avoiding shots and countering with precision that even the Admiral couldn't immediately understand. He stared intently at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing: a child in control of a situation that would have overwhelmed an experienced warrior. The simulation intensified as enemy ships surrounded the child's virtual vessel. The Admiral watched in growing curiosity as the child's fingers flew across the controls. The holographic display shifted with every movement. The child dodged a barrage of laser fire effortlessly, then countered with a series of calculated strikes that dismantled the incoming attackers with uncanny precision. The Admiral's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. How could a child move with such confidence and accuracy, as if they were born to fly in the face of danger? He was used to observing great pilots and strategists, but this child seemed to operate on an entirely different level. The Admiral couldn't help but wonder what it was about the humans that allowed them to produce such exceptional minds. Was it their relentless drive, their curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, something innate that no one fully understood? As the battle simulation progressed, the child's movements became even more erratic, but in a way that was oddly mesmerizing. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by the chaos around them, the child adapted each second, as if the odds didn't matter, as if they were already 10 steps ahead of the enemies closing in. The Admiral's experience told him that under such pressure most beings would falter or at least show signs of hesitation, but this child did not falter, not once. The child's starship dove toward an asteroid field. an area most pilots would avoid at all costs, yet the child navigated it with an unshakable calmness. The simulation was filled with unpredictable twists. Asteroids veered toward the ship at high velocity and enemy ships followed closely behind, but the child responded with an effortless precision. The ship twisted and turned through the deadly field without a single hit landing. The child didn't seem to fear the obstacles ahead. In fact, the Admiral realized with a growing sense of awe, the child seemed to welcome them. The Admiral's attention sharpened as the child faced a larger threat. The simulation had introduced a massive enemy dreadnought. Its presence on the screen was almost overwhelming. The Admiral had witnessed these ships in real battles and knew firsthand the sheer devastation they could bring, yet the child didn't panic. They didn't hesitate. They waited for the perfect moment and then initiated a daring offensive move. The move was unexpected and risky. The child didn't try to outrun the dreadnought or face it head-on. Instead, they used the environment around them. The asteroid field was no longer just a barrier, it became an asset. The child maneuvered the ship in tight turns, using the asteroids as cover against the dreadnought's firepower. The Admiral's eyes widened as the child's ship broke through a gap between two large asteroids and fired a shot that hit the dreadnought's weak point, directly. A victory against an overwhelmingly powerful foe. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. This child had faced an impossible situation and turned it into an opportunity. The Admiral felt a chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. This was not just a game or a simple training exercise. The child had just demonstrated a level of ingenuity and foresight that was far beyond the expectations of any species he had encountered. The child was not just reacting to the simulation, they were shaping it to their advantage. And in that moment, the Admiral knew this was no ordinary being. The Admiral took a step back, still processing what he had just witnessed. The simulation had ended, the virtual environment fading away, leaving only the child sitting calmly in the cockpit. The enemy ships and the massive dreadnought were gone. The screen now displayed a simple congratulatory message for completing the simulation, but the Admiral couldn't take his eyes off the child, who had just proven something far more important than any victory in a virtual battle. The child slowly unstrapped from the simulator chair and stood up, stretching as if they had just completed a simple task rather than something that would have defeated even the most seasoned pilots. The Admiral watched as the child walked toward the exit without any sign of fatigue or excitement, as if this had been just another day at the office. His curiosity grew stronger. With each passing second, he had to know more. He motioned for the crew member to approach, and the young officer stepped forward, standing at attention. The Admiral's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Who is this child?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the small figure who was now chatting casually with a nearby crew member. The officer glanced at the child before speaking. "Sir, this is Ilara, a special candidate for the human pilot training program. She's one of the youngest to ever pass the advanced simulations, and she's considered to have an extraordinary ability to adapt in high-stress scenarios." The officer hesitated for a moment before continuing. "She's been through a variety of simulations, both in combat and survival situations, and has passed every one with unusual success." The Admiral was intrigued. "Unusual success?" he repeated under his breath, his mind already racing to consider what that could mean for the future of humanity. If this child was just one example of the human youth, what could their entire species accomplish in the span of a generation or two? The officer continued. "Her ability to improvise strategies on the fly has made her one of the top candidates for future missions beyond the training simulations." There was a pause before the officer added, "It's also worth mentioning she has no formal training in combat tactics or starship piloting. She simply understands it on a level that no one can quite explain." The Admiral's gaze shifted back to Ilara, who was now looking up at the control room with a bright smile on her face. The child seemed unaware of the enormity of what she had just accomplished, or perhaps she was simply unbothered by it all. Either way, the Admiral couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He turned to the officer with a renewed sense of urgency. "Arrange a private meeting with Ilara," he commanded, his voice steady but firm. "I need to understand how she thinks." As the officer nodded and hurried to follow his orders, the Admiral found himself lost in thought. The human race had always been seen as a species with boundless potential, but this was something different. This was more than potential. This was a new way of thinking, a new way of being. And if the humans were capable of producing minds like Ilara's, then the galaxy had better prepare itself for a force it could never fully predict or control. The Admiral realized that the real danger wasn't just their ability to fight or conquer, it was their unpredictability, their capacity to break free from any mold and redefine the rules of engagement. The Admiral waited patiently in the observation room, his hands folded behind his back. As the minutes ticked by, he couldn't stop thinking about Ilara, how she had handled the simulation with such confidence and skill. It was as if she had tapped into something beyond mere training, something instinctual and yet deeply advanced at the same time. Her unorthodox methods had shaken his confidence in ways he had not expected. A few minutes later, the door to the room opened, and Ilara walked in with the same unassuming smile on her face, as if the Admiral was just another person she had to meet. Her small frame contrasted with the imposing technology around her, but there was no hesitation in her step. She walked forward without fear or uncertainty. "You wanted to speak with me." Her voice was calm, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. The Admiral studied her for a moment, wondering how much of the child before him was simply an extension of their species' boundless ambition, and how much was something altogether unique. "Yes," the Admiral said, his voice steady, but with an edge of intensity. "You've shown exceptional skill in the simulations. I need to understand how you think. When you were in that simulation, how did you know what to do?" he asked, his tone not unkind but probing. Ilara tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. "I just reacted," she said simply. "I know that sounds weird, but it's like everything slows down, and I can see what's going to happen next, even before it does." The Admiral's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected such an answer. The child didn't speak like a typical soldier or strategist. She spoke like someone describing an instinctual process, something deeper than the tactical training he was accustomed to hearing from warriors across the galaxy. "Slow down," he repeated, intrigued. "So you aren't thinking in the traditional sense, you're feeling it?" Ilara nodded. "Yeah. It's like all the information I need is right in front of me. I just have to focus on it. And then I know how to act. I can tell where the enemies are going to be before they even get there." She smiled as if the answer was obvious. The Admiral couldn't hide the shock on his face. How could this child possibly have such insight? It was something beyond his comprehension. Yet there she was, speaking so matter-of-factly, as if this kind of thinking came naturally to her. And when the asteroid field came up, the Admiral asked, pressing further, "Why did you choose to fly through it instead of avoiding it?" Ilara didn't hesitate. "Because the enemy wouldn't expect it. No one expects a kid to fly into danger," she shrugged. "But if you can use something against them they don't see coming, then you get the advantage. And the best part is the ship doesn't need to outrun them if you use the asteroids to shield you." The Admiral's mind raced. The child's thought process was unlike anything he had encountered. Her ability to turn the environment into an asset had baffled him. He had assumed that most beings would look for a way to avoid danger, not embrace it. Yet Ilara's instinct was to dive straight into the chaos and use it as a weapon. He leaned forward. "How do you know these things? Where does it come from?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling that his question wasn't going to yield the answer he expected. Ilara shrugged again. "I guess it's just how I think. I don't really know why. It's just always been there." The Admiral sat back, his mind reeling. This wasn't something he could easily explain. It wasn't something he could prepare for. The child wasn't just thinking outside the box. She had no box to begin with. The Admiral's mind churned as he tried to process what Ilara had just said. Her casual demeanor only made the situation more unsettling. This wasn't some clever trick or an advanced tactical maneuver. She wasn't using some form of alien technology to give her an edge. No, she was simply acting on an instinct that seemed to come from a place far beyond any logic he had ever known. He studied her face closely, trying to find any hint of deception, but there was none. She wasn't hiding anything. Her eyes were clear and open, and for all her youth, she spoke with a calmness that would put seasoned veterans to shame. The Admiral had encountered many great minds in his time, But this child was different. This was something new, something that had the potential to change the entire course of galactic conflict. He couldn't help but ask another question. Do you ever think about the consequences of your actions when you're in the simulator? His voice was soft, but the question was important, because if she had truly mastered the ability to act instinctively without considering the outcomes, then there was no telling what kind of risks she might take in real combat. Ilara paused for a moment before answering. Not really, I just focus on what's in front of me, and let the rest follow. If I overthink things, then I start making mistakes. She shrugged again, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. I trust that what I do will work because it always has. The Admiral's brow furrowed even more. This child had no fear. She didn't hesitate to make the boldest moves without worrying about the risks. The Admiral had seen warriors who thrived on calculated strategies, those who measured every possibility before making their move. But Ilara wasn't like them. She didn't rely on analysis or careful planning. She just acted with an almost supernatural confidence that baffled him. He sat in silence for a few moments, trying to digest everything she had said, and everything he had witnessed. Her skill in the simulation was impressive, but it was her mindset that truly left him in awe and fear for the future, humanity's future. If all their youth had this ability to act without hesitation to turn chaos into an advantage, then the galaxy was facing a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be predicted or easily contained. Tell me, the Admiral said slowly, what do you think of the war simulations they've been training you for? Do you believe they are necessary? Ilara's eyes sparkled for a moment as if she were thinking deeply. I think it's good to practice, but I don't really think about war the way they do. I just want to learn how to handle anything that comes at me and be ready for it. She paused and looked at the Admiral, her expression shifting to something more serious. War is just a big mess, and I don't want to be part of that mess if I don't have to. The Admiral was stunned at the simplicity of her response. It wasn't a rejection of war or violence. It was a rejection of the mindset that viewed conflict as the only solution to problems. She saw it as a chaos to be avoided, not embraced. For the first time since entering the human starship, the Admiral began to question everything he knew about war and strategy. Perhaps the greatest threat humanity posed wasn't in their ability to fight, but in their ability to rethink what fighting even meant. He watched Ilara with a growing sense of dread and awe, realizing that humanity might just be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not because of their strength, but because of their ability to adapt to any challenge without hesitation or fear. The Admiral stood up, his thoughts racing as he watched Ilara leave the room. He had come here expecting to learn more about human strategies, expecting to understand how they thought, and how they might fit into the grand designs of galactic politics. Instead, he felt like he was staring into the unknown, like he had glimpsed something so unpredictable and dangerous that it had shaken the very foundation of his understanding. As Ilara walked out of the room, the Admiral's mind flashed to the larger picture. If this was just one child, what did that mean for humanity as a whole? What if there were hundreds, thousands more like her, all capable of thinking and reacting in ways that no other species could anticipate? He had seen many civilizations rise and fall, but none had ever demonstrated the kind of mental agility that this young human had. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw his most trusted officer enter the room. The officer, a tall and disciplined being, had been with the Admiral for many years, and they had fought side by side in countless campaigns. Yet today, the officer seemed almost uneasy, as if something had unsettled them as well. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "the simulation results have been reviewed. We've analyzed everything from Ilara's tactics to her decision-making patterns. We've never seen anything like it." "No, we haven't," the Admiral replied, his voice low. "There's something more to it. She's not just responding to the simulation, she's bending it to her will." The officer hesitated before speaking again. "We've also run simulations with other human candidates, but none have displayed the same adaptability. It's as if Ilara has a unique gift. Her ability to see through the chaos and act without hesitation is beyond any standard training protocol. The Admiral's gaze grew distant as he processed the officer's words. A unique gift. That was one way to put it. But there was something more dangerous in that. If one child could adapt to the most extreme circumstances and think in ways that defied traditional warfare, what would happen when humanity's greatest minds were fully developed? The galaxy wasn't prepared for that kind of unpredictability. Sir, do you think this could be the result of human evolution? The officer asked, almost as if reading the Admiral's thoughts. That they have a biological or neurological advantage we're missing. Perhaps, the Admiral murmured. But I think it's more than that. It's not just their biology. It's their mindset. They're not bound by the same constraints we are. They don't approach conflict with the same rigid rules. The officer looked thoughtful. It's as if they see the battlefield not as a place of limited options, but as a puzzle to be solved. There are no boundaries to their thinking. The Admiral's expression darkened as he finally grasped the true magnitude of the situation. Humanity wasn't just adapting to the universe. They were reshaping it. Their mindset, free of conventional limitations, allowed them to turn even the most chaotic of circumstances into an advantage. There was no way to predict how they would fight, how they would think, or how they would overcome an enemy. We've been underestimating them, the Admiral said quietly. For too long. The officer nodded. We may have to change our approach to humanities. Sir. Yes, the Admiral replied, his voice hardening. Because if this is the future of humanity, then we've only seen the beginning. And I'm not sure we're ready for what comes next. As the officer left the room, the Admiral stood alone, contemplating the strange, terrifying potential of the human species. What had once seemed like a race to be guided and controlled was now a force that could potentially reshape the galaxy itself. And for the first time in his long career, the Admiral felt the stirrings of true fear. The Admiral spent the following days observing more human training exercises and simulations. As much as he tried to focus on other matters, his mind kept drifting back to Ilara and her unusual ability to think beyond the constraints of any conventional training. Every time he watched her, he saw something new, something more unsettling, and it was clear to him that this wasn't an isolated case. Humans, in general, seemed to think differently from any species he had encountered before. He had assumed that the more experienced humans would be the ones to demonstrate their worth, but time and again, it was the younger ones, the untrained ones, who showed the most promise. It wasn't just their quick reflexes or their sharp instincts. It was their ability to improvise and adapt in the most dire of situations. They had an innate sense of opportunity, a deep understanding of how to use what was around them to gain an advantage. Where others saw limits, the humans saw possibilities. He had come to a conclusion that both excited and terrified him. Humanity was not just a new species in the galaxy. They were a species that had yet to fully tap into their potential, and if they ever did, the galaxy would be forever changed. As the Admiral continued his observations, his thoughts kept returning to the question he had asked Ilara that day. Why didn't she think about the consequences of her actions? He had seen the results of her thinking, and they were extraordinary, but it also concerned him. The humans' willingness to act without hesitation was part of what made them dangerous. They were unpredictable, unafraid of failure, and always willing to push the boundaries of what was possible. He had seen humans take risks in ways that other species would never consider. They were willing to sacrifice what others would consider vital for the chance at success, and more often than not, it worked. This was a quality that no empire, no matter how strong or how old, had ever demonstrated to the same degree. One afternoon, as he walked through the corridors of the human ship, he was approached by a senior officer. The officer, though normally composed, seemed nervous, almost on edge. The Admiral raised an eyebrow as the officer came to stand before him. "Sir, we've received troubling reports," the officer said, his voice low. "There's been some unrest on the outer colonies. A few of the more radical factions are beginning to rally against the peace treaties. They're afraid that humanity will become too powerful, that the treaties are nothing more than a way for us to control them. The Admiral's brow furrowed. Is there any immediate threat? Not yet, the officer replied, but the situation is deteriorating rapidly. The factions are gaining support, and they're beginning to call for a military response. They're using your observations of the human training programs as evidence that we've underestimated them, that we've made a grave mistake in trusting humanity. The Admiral's mind spun. They believe the humans will become a threat because they can think outside the box. He asked incredulously. It's more than that, sir, the officer said. They believe humanity will evolve into a force that is impossible to control. And they're not wrong. If these young humans can think like this, without fear, without limits, what happens when they're adults? What happens when they're in command? The Admiral stood in silence for a moment. The officer's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he began to see the greater implications. Humanity's strength wasn't just in their technology or their numbers. It was in their ability to think differently. They could be the galaxy's greatest asset, or it could become the most unpredictable threat the galaxy had ever seen. We need to prepare for both possibilities, the Admiral said finally. We cannot afford to make the same mistake twice. Keep an eye on the situation. We may have to make decisions sooner than we thought. As the officer nodded and left, the Admiral's thoughts turned back to Ilara, to the unpredictability of humanity. He had seen the first signs of what they could do. And now it was clear that no matter how much they prepared, the humans would always be 2 steps ahead, shifting the game in ways no one could anticipate. The Admiral stood alone in the command center, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out into the vastness of space. The stars beyond seemed endless, yet within that infinite expanse, humanity had begun to carve its place. Everything had changed in such a short time. Everything he had thought he knew about strategy, about power, had been upended by the very thing he had underestimated, the unpredictability of human potential. A report flashed across his console, another update about the unrest on the outer colonies. The factions calling for rebellion were growing in number, their calls for independence and fear of humanity's rise resonating across the galaxy. Yet as troubling as that was, the Admiral knew that the true danger wasn't the factions, but what the humans themselves might decide to do next. Ilara's image came to his mind again, the child who had turned a training simulation into a masterclass of innovation and instinct. She had no formal training in warfare, no strategic education, yet she had outsmarted the best in ways that seemed impossible. He had seen it in her, and now, after all his observations, he realized the full extent of what made humanity so dangerous. They weren't bound by the rigid rules and tactics that other species lived by. They thought beyond them, creating their own paths through any challenge. There was no predicting what they would do next, and that made them more unpredictable than any enemy he had ever faced. The door behind him opened, and the officer from earlier entered, his face grim. "Sir, we've received a direct message from the human leadership. They want to meet with you." The Admiral turned, sensing the gravity in the officer's tone. "A meeting? What about?" "They want to discuss the future of humanity's role in the galaxy," the officer replied. "They've seen the reports, the unrest. They know what's being said about them." The Admiral paused. He had known that the humans would one day seek to define their place in the galaxy, but he had never anticipated the situation would reach this point so quickly. Humanity was no longer simply a species to be observed. They were a force that could no longer be ignored. "Arrange the meeting," the Admiral said after a moment, his voice steady. "Prepare for everything." The officer nodded and left the room, and the Admiral turned his attention back to the stars. What was humanity's next move? Could they be trusted, or was their unpredictability a ticking time bomb waiting to explode? As he prepared for the meeting, the Admiral's thoughts turned to the broader implications of what humanity could become. They were not a species driven solely by logic or tradition. They were driven by something else, a thirst for discovery, a desire to push beyond the boundaries of what others believed was possible. This made them both an incredible ally and a terrifying adversary. He knew one thing for certain: humanity would change the galaxy. And whether that change would bring peace or chaos was no longer in anyone's hands but theirs. The question was, how would the galaxy react to their unpredictable rise? The doors to the command center opened once more, and the Admiral stood tall, ready to face whatever humanity had in store. As he walked toward the meeting, he realized that the real danger wasn't in fighting them or fearing their strength. It was in the fact that they could not be controlled or predicted. And in that, they held a power no one else could ever hope to match. This was the beginning of something new, a new era. And whether he was ready for it or not, the Admiral knew he would have to adapt to humanity's rules or risk being left behind.